Welcome back to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast, where human wonder fuels the quest for Christian wisdom. It only takes a little bit of historical awareness to be aware how frequently and prominently the meaning of the Lord's Supper has been a debate among Christians of various stripes. This was especially the case after the Reformation, when several branches of the new Reformed movement interpreted the mode of Christ's presence in the supper quite differently. We're perhaps a bit less at each other's throats these days about the technicality and metaphysics of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist, but it is also likely the case that many of us tacitly encounter the supper as something that is a bit odd. Of course, we do it, but it is also probably fair to say that we find it an intuitively peculiar practice. What's the significance of eating this bread and drinking this wine together? And of course, we have several answers to this: remembrance, the presence of Christ, the unity of Christians, etc. And maybe those understandings do shape our conscious experience of the supper, but I'd still wager that even with all those explanations, we probably still have the capacity to step back and find the whole exercise just a little bit strange for modern people. Probably for those converting to Christianity from the outside, it is one of the less intuitively, yeah, I get why we do that kinds of practices. And as it turns out, we're not alone in this. Christian and non-Christian historians of first century religion have spent an enormous amount of ink trying to understand the background and development of the Christian Eucharist. With me today is Dr. Matthew Colvin, who is a presbyter in the Reformed Episcopal Church and has a PhD in classics from Cornell University. Dr. Colvin has recently penned a very stimulating volume, The Lost Supper, Revisiting Passover and the Origins of the Eucharist. This is a work of tremendous detail and scholarship, and Matthew has graciously agreed to come talk to us about it. Not only does it provide some wonderful insight into many tricky New Testament texts, Dr. Colvin helpfully relates his conclusions to post-New Testament theological debates about the supper, illuminating where many of our interpretations have perhaps taken a wrong turn. So first things first, Matthew, thank you for joining us on the program today.
It's a joy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I think it's always illuminating and interesting to hear why people take on the projects that they do. And so, if you would, tell us why this became a research project of interest to you and what's at stake for you in it.
Well, I made the mistake of marrying a Jewish lady, and I did that while I was a PhD student in Greek. And so I was invited to a Passover Seder, and I was sitting through it, and all these Hebrew prayers were washing over me, my uncircumcised Gentile head. And I didn't understand a word of it, except for one word that I heard it, afikomen. I said, wait a minute, that's a Greek word, surely. And several months later, after doing some research, I discovered I wasn't the only person who thought it was a Greek word. And so that got me on the track of David Dalbis and Robert Eisler's hypothesis about the origins of the Eucharist and the meaning of the Last Supper in terms of the Passover and antecedent rituals. And it was been a 17-year journey of researching, learning Hebrew, not learning Aramaic, but investigating Aramaic. And becoming familiar as a classicist with this entire world of first century Judaism, an effort to understand something, as you say, that I'd been doing since I was a child, right? Partaking of the supper. And not, eventually you reach a certain point and you say, wait a minute, what are we doing? And why do we say these words? And why do we use these elements? And what's the Jewish background of this? So that was the impetus for it.
Yeah, and speaking of the kind of the Jewish element here, one of the debates that is sort of a background to your own work is the debate over really how to interpret the words and actions of Jesus. I know a little bit about that debate, but just for our listeners, can you briefly tell us about the third quest for the historical Jesus and how it helps us frame our quest for the historical origins of the Eucharist?
Sure. I think I got into Jesus studies by discovering N.T. Wright at the same time that I discovered David Dalby, and beginning to read these scholars, Wright, Dunn, Sanders, and so forth, not exclusively New Perspective scholars, but it was the New Perspective that brought me into it. But not so much the Pauline side of it. It was really Jesus's work, N.T. Wright's work on Jesus that got me interested in thinking about Jesus historically. Particularly his insistence that there should not be a division between the Jesus of faith and the Jesus of history. And it was Jesus and the victory of God that sort of shook my world. I didn't have to give up the things that I believed as a Christian. I was Presbyterian and a PCA at the time. And suddenly I had all these more vivid historical understandings of what Jesus was saying and doing. And so when we come to Jesus celebrating his last Passover with his disciples, the reports that we have in the Gospels and in 1 Corinthians are full of the sort of detail that characterizes eyewitness reports from participants in a very Jewish ritual meal. And yet there are scholars who want to claim that the gospel reports of the Last Supper are fabrications or retrojections of the early church's practice, that they've made up this legend about Jesus doing things that they actually do, designed to address the early church's concerns and have nothing really much to do with the historical Jesus's questions and concerns and the sorts of debates that he was having with his Jewish contemporaries. And so I want to say as strongly as I can that that's an utterly unacceptable solution. And it falsifies the nature of the Gospels as historical documents. And we can do better as Christians, seeking to follow Jesus, and as historians, seeking to know the truth about what Jesus said and did. I think the third quest offers us a way forward. And as N.T. Wright likes to say, is it really Jesus we would like to know and follow, or would we prefer an idol of our own making?
Right. And as I understand it, the third quest is it's an attempt, and you can help me out here. It's an attempt to put Jesus it's an attempt to interpret the words and actions of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus over against a Jewish context, as opposed to maybe some ways that were popular for the previous century of scholarship, to sort of see Jesus in the context of, at one point it would have been Hellenistic, sort of mystery religions. And then if you sort of see Christianity against that backdrop, I'm guessing you see the Eucharist as, one of these sort of mystery religion, ceremonies or something like this.
Yeah, there's two things occur to me that you prompt me with that comment. One is the dominance of German New Testament scholarship in the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. And they had real problems with the whole idea of Jesus as Jewish, that they wanted to see him sort of in conflict with Judaism, not really Jewish. And obviously the third quest has really rejected that. Jesus is a first century Jew, and he needs to be understood in first century Jewish terms, or we're not going to understand him at all. The second thing, right. You mentioned mystery religions. I remember my first graduate seminar at Cornell was on Greek religions, and we had to read Jane Harrison and Walter Burkert, and these scholars explaining how does Greek initiation work. And we put you in a pit and we sacrifice a pig over you, or we lead you blindfolded into the sanctuary of Demeter at Eleusis and show you whatever it is they show you, a piece of corn or something. So it's a religion of initiation that operates with deiknoumena and initiation mysteries. And there's been quite a lot of scholarship trying to approach the Eucharist that way. I think it influenced some of the work of Joachim Jeremias, and his excellent Eucharistic words of Jesus, nonetheless frames the whole thing as this Eucharistic mystery that we don't show outsiders. We don't tell them what Jesus said at the Last Supper. And so when Jeremias comes to try to interpret the words, "This is my body" or "This is my blood," he kind of scratches his head over it and says, I don't know what it means. It's not comprehensible, and it must be incomprehensible because Jesus shared this secret explanation at his Passover discourse with his disciples, and the gospel writers have carefully snipped that out in order to continue to conceal the mystery from us.
Oh, right.
And that's just not very plausible, and I think it's an inappropriate influence of Greek mystery religion scholarship.
That actually helps contextualize then this next question. You've mentioned one of these names already, but your research in particular attempts to recover the work of two 20th century scholars, Robert Eisler and David Daube. Is that how you pronounce it?
I think it's a sounded E, so Daube. Yeah.
Daube. Okay. Can you briefly describe what their central claim was and how it differs from the hypotheses that were and maybe still are on the table? I suppose we've already talked about some of those hypotheses, but what were their central claims, basically?
Sure. Part of the delight of this project for me was familiarizing myself with these two scholars, because they are a pair of characters. Both of their lives were interrupted and traumatized by Hitler and the Nazi Party and the whole World War II. Daube ended his days as an exile from his native Germany, taught at Oxford for a long time, and then at California, Berkeley in the States into his 80s. And Eisler, for his part, converted from Judaism to Christianity in order to marry a famous painter's daughter. It wasn't a genuine conversion. And then found himself kind of stuck. Jews didn't want him, and Christians didn't want him because he was Jewish. And he was independently wealthy. And
that always helps.
Yeah, and he's kind of outside the guild. Daube is outside the guild. He's a scholar of the history of law. Eisler is outside the guild. He's a maniac, a difficult man, writing books on crazy subjects like werewolves and the history of bees. And so he's this sort of polymath, grabbing things from all over the place and synthesizing them into sometimes very implausible explanations where your jaw sort of drops at the erudition of it, but it isn't necessarily the best explanation historically. If you look for explanation, if you look up David Daube, Last Supper, Afikomen, one of the things you'll find on the web these days is a bunch of websites from Messianic Judaism who are eager to interpret the Passover and all kinds of other Jewish rituals and meals and holidays and customs in terms of Jesus, to connect them with Jesus. And it's a movement is very focused on the Jewishness of it all, and in my opinions, often in ways that the Apostle Paul would not be too thrilled about. That they're focusing on many of the things that Paul would say are rubbish or skubalon, and they elevated them to a level that they shouldn't have. And the scholarship of that movement is often quite sketchy. But the central thesis, Daube is a world-class scholar, and he's the man, maybe more than anyone else, who gave rise to the acceptability of the term New Testament Judaism. Right? And he pioneers some of the use of the rabbis, use of rabbinical sources as evidence for some things that were still, or that were still being taught, that had already been taught at the time of Jesus, or were operative in the first century. So those two scholars are characters and very interesting. The central thesis that Daube presents in the 1960s is that Jesus was taking up an already understood and known piece of bread that everybody knew was connected with the Messiah, and he was identifying himself in terms of it. Eisler had presented that earlier, but Eisler had committed some scholarly mistakes. He had said, we can go raid the whole medieval Jewish Passover Seder with its sequence of cups, four named cups, and with its specified and named pieces of unleavened bread, matzah, and we can find that all operative in the New Testament. And Daube said, no, not really. We don't have enough evidence that any of that stuff was being done. But the central claim that Jesus could not have both taken up a piece of bread and identified it with the Messiah, and then also identified it with himself, that seems to me to be a good starting point. This is something that he did at the Last Supper, and his disciples don't seem to have been puzzled by it. Right? They seem to have understood what he meant. Later on the road to Emmaus, he is known to some of his disciples in the breaking of the bread. They don't scratch their head and act puzzled the way they do on many other occasions. Right? Peter, at the Mount of Transfiguration, Lord, it's good for us to be here. He didn't know what he was saying. Right? Or the disciples in the boat, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Herod. Is it because we forgot to bring bread? Right? And they were clueless. Right? And they tell us when they're clueless, but they don't say anything about being clueless at the Last Supper. So that's the central claim that Dalbe is making.
Right. Just for our listeners, actually, I was going to ask this a little later, but I think it's more relevant based upon what you just said, and that is, tell us what you think Jesus is doing in the Last Supper then. What if we could sort of expand that for people who are kind of uninitiated to this identification with the kind of this bread that has messianic significance. Fill that out a little bit for us.
Okay, so on Dalbe's view and mine, the main thing that Jesus is doing is identifying himself as Israel's Messiah. And he's doing so within the context of a ritual meal that Second Temple Jews already used to inscribe themselves in the story of Israel from the Old Testament. And second, I want to say he's making this self-identification as the Messiah in an indirect manner. And this is distinctive of his practice. Jesus doesn't don a sandwich board and walk around with a sign on it saying, I'm the Messiah. Right? As we're told in John's Gospel, Jesus doesn't testify about himself. Anybody who testifies about himself and says, I'm the Messiah, it's ipso facto untrue. It's inconsistent with the behavior and character of the true Messiah. It's false messiahs. Judas of Galilee or someone like that who boasts about his status or says he's someone great and uses it as a thing to be grasped. Jesus' approach is always to identify himself in terms of Israel's stories and Israel's symbols for those who know that story and those who know the symbols and have ears to hear. So when he's faced with huge questions like, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Right? It's the Sanhedrin asks him. Or are you a king from Pilate? He tends to answer those questions with a peculiarly Jewish idiom. You have said it. Right? It doesn't mean, yes, I am. Right? It's a non-denial. Right? Yeah, you're right about that. But it came out of your mouth. Right?
Yeah.
Right? It came out of your mouth, not mine.
Right.
So, and it's a Jewish idiom, amartah in Hebrew. Right? You have said it. And it's striking because it's the same idiom that Jesus uses for other inappropriate questions that he doesn't want to answer with a straight yes or no. Like when Judas asks him, is it I, Lord, who am going to betray you? Jesus doesn't say, bingo, go do it. Right? He says, you have said it. Right? And the other thing that he does with Judas on that inappropriate question, he answers it in a second way. Lord, who is it going to betray you? Is it I? Is it I? Right? He sets up a piece of bread and gives it a meaning, stipulated meaning for his disciples to understand, and then hands it to Judas. So his disciples can put two and two together, and they can draw the conclusion that he wants them to draw. And it avoids a direct and public accusation while still making the point for all the disciples who are in the know about the meaning of that morsel that he handed to Judas. And it's in exactly the same way, Jesus identifies himself with a piece of bread that has a known meaning to his disciples. So that's the first two things. Right? It's within this ritual context of a meal that Second Temple Jews already know. And secondly, it's typical of Jesus's indirection, right? His indirect approach to identifying himself. The third thing he's doing is using the ritual meal to involve his disciples in the events of his death and resurrection that are about to happen. And he does this in exactly the same way that the Passover involved every subsequent generation of Jews in the events of the original Exodus. We need to take very seriously the fact that the Jews in the first century had ways of thinking and talking. They had ways of understanding how their meal at Passover worked. And they didn't talk about it the way Thomas Aquinas or Augustine or even the Apostolic Fathers do. There was such a thing as first century Jewish sacramentology, and Jesus did not invent it. That's one of David Dauber's most brilliant insights and a huge methodological correction that ought to inform our thinking about how the Eucharist works. The Passover was instituted in advance of the events that sealed it to every Israelite who later celebrated it. Right? In advance of the events, right? That Moses, with God's command, tells them, this is what you got to do. And then the deliverance from Egypt happens. The angel of death passes over all the houses with the blood on their doorposts and lintels. And then thereafter, they celebrate Passovers in the land, right? Retrospective Passovers. Just so, Jesus sets up the bread and wine in connection with his death and resurrection before they happen. And then he sets up a ritual meal for his disciples to continue celebrating it after those events. There's a lot more that we could say about how this works, but central to it all is that we ought to think about it, how it works, the way Jews thought about how Passover operated. And so it's really important for us to turn to Jewish literature, the Targums, the rabbinic literature, the Mishnah and the Talmuds, and to see how they discuss the Passover. Not that everything they say should be taken to be operative in the first century. We don't want to commit anachronisms, nor that they accurately reflect everything that Jesus and his disciples were doing. But this is the key. They generally reflect Jewish ways of thinking about how Passover operated. And when we do that, we find that the basic idea is summed up in an utterance of probably Paul's teacher, Rabbi Gamaliel, who says, every man who partakes of the Passover is bound to regard himself as though he personally had passed out of Egypt. Right? If you're eating this Passover meal, it is as though, ke'elu, right? Just as if you had personally experienced the events that happened in the generation of Moses. Right? So that's a Jewish way of thinking about it. Notice that it's not a way of thinking about substances and accidents. Right? Right. It doesn't use the apparatus of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, nor, and we'll talk more about this maybe later, nor does it use a sort of cognitive approach. The Passover originally happened, the angel of death passed over those houses while Jews were asleep in bed. I mean, they weren't thinking about it at the time. And so there's evidently a Jewish way of approaching this meal that is neither a matter of transmogrified substances nor a matter of cognitive recollection. Right? Instead, it's a matter of the narrative, the story of Israel and their God, the events that happened to Israel at the hand of their God. And for us, as we're dealing with the Eucharist, not the Passover, it's the events that happened to Jesus, our Messiah, that we're united to. N.T. Wright said at one point, and I've struggled in vain to track down where I saw this, that the sacraments should be celebrated narratively. Right? They have to do with the story. They inscribe us in the story. And so that, I think, is a very Jewish way of approaching how do the sacraments work. It's a way that was available to Jesus, that was already operative at the meal that he sat down at with his disciples. And if he wants to change the way the meal is going to work, if he wants to institute a new meal that has been de-Pascalized, de-Passoverized, that's an incredibly difficult job. If you're going to do that, why would you do it at Passover? Right. That is not a good plan.
Right. That actually, one of the questions that comes out of this in terms of if we identify, and your book just makes such a compelling case that we ought to, if we identify the Passover as sort of the background to the development of Christian Eucharistic practice, one of the questions that comes up is, why then did Christian Eucharistic practice so quickly develop into a weekly or even more frequent observance as opposed to an annual observance? Do you have some thoughts on what was behind that development?
Yeah, it is evidently something that needs to be explained. The Passover is an annual ceremony, and the Eucharist is, I would say, not just a weekly, but a more than weekly ceremony that we see in the New Testament. That needs explaining. And my answer would be, I think it's not tied to time. It is tied to the community. Very early, we find the book of Acts speaking of Sunday as the first day of the week when the disciples came together to break bread. Right? Or even earlier than that, the Road to Emmaus episode in Luke shows the resurrected Jesus evidently using the bread to identify himself again, and in a way that his disciples get. Right? He was known to them in the breaking of the bread. And he does that. It's not Passover anymore when he's doing it. Right? So there's evidently very early, and probably underwritten by Jesus himself in his meals with his disciples, there's warrant for doing it more often, and for doing it when the people of Jesus are gathered together, the ones for whom he died. They unite themselves to him in this ritual meal that he set up and gave them. So when the church is gathered to celebrate the death and resurrection of Christ, it was apparently natural for them to do so in the context of a meal, and that meant that it happened more than weekly. There's a lot. That's a little bit of a sketchy explanation, right? All I'm saying there is we see that it happened. We see that it happened really early. So it's a fact that needs some explaining. I think one of the most interesting books that I read on this topic, there's just a little essay by Oscar Coleman, Essays on the Lord's Supper, in which he points out that, I think it's in Acts 3 maybe or so, in one of the early chapters of Acts, there's a verb, sunaritsomai, right? That the disciples were gathered together, and some translations will say when they gathered together, right? It was simply a matter of congregating. But the root of that word is probably from the Greek word haus, salt, to share a meal with salt. Some of our early Eucharistic imagery in say, catacomb paintings and elsewhere depicts fish. Jesus shared a meal with fish with his disciples on the shore of the sea after his resurrection. And so it looks like there are reminiscences of salt and fish and other elements besides bread and wine. Not that salt and fish have the sort of symbolic weight that the bread and the wine do. Not that they've been singled out by Jesus with words of institution and set up for our use this way, but that the early church was preserving certain remembered features of meals that they had with Jesus, and those meals, of course, were beyond just the one Last Supper. And so I do think those are helpful, possible contributing factors to why did the church move to more than weekly. They're gathered about Jesus. That's enough warrant, perhaps.
Right. That's very helpful. Some of the argument in the book is as you can tell just from sort of looking up in some cases this very obscure vocabulary, and in fact the thing that kind of triggered you toward this project in the first place sounds like a vocabulary word you heard during a Seder. So some of it's pretty technical and depends upon attempts to kind of discover Aramaisms and this sort of thing behind the New Testament as we have it. Can you describe what that trend is in New Testament scholarship, this attempt to kind of get at the Aramaic behind the Greek, and maybe give us an example of where this obviously helps us be better readers of the text, even if the example is not the Eucharist as such?
Yeah, I don't know that I would say it is a trend in New Testament scholarship. Those of you who are listening who are interested in New Testament studies, if you've ever thought about doing a PhD in New Testament studies, is one of the most daunting things you could ever choose to study. The linguistic requirements are extremely high. You need to know French, you need to know German, you need to know Latin, let alone, of course, Greek and Hebrew as the core, and then Aramaic and Ugaritic, and maybe a little bit of Akkadian, and on it goes. And few and far between are the men who have the time to actually accumulate all these languages. I don't have all these languages. But I think it's necessary that it is this way. We have to take seriously the fact that we're dealing with texts that were written by multilingual, polyglot Jews, right? First century Jews living in Hellenized Palestine. And I think we can find there's been sort of shifts in how do New Testament scholars approach this issue. So the late Maurice Casey, who's not a Christian, he's an unbeliever, and he's got some views that I would rather strongly disagree with. So he wrote one book called Is John's Gospel True? And as you know, any title that ends with a question mark can be answered with the word no. So his book is intended to say, no, John, the fourth gospel is this gigantic fabrication of retrojection or fathering upon Jesus of the concerns of the early church. And I would tend to side much more with Richard Bauckham, who says, no, the fourth gospel is eyewitness testimony and written, moreover, by an eyewitness. But Casey, despite all those abhorrent opinions and his Bart Ehrmanish tendencies, nonetheless was a major advocate of Aramaic behind the Gospels. Now, that doesn't mean there's a set of Aramaic Gospels and maybe a goat herd will find some in a cave in Israel one of these days. That's not what we mean. What we mean is that we're dealing with Greek texts that have been written by Jews for whom Greek is not their first language. And as Maurice Casey puts it, anybody who's writing not in their first language is going to suffer in whatever degree from what we call linguistic interference. And we see this in the way they use Greek, departing from Greek idiom. And as a classicist, it strikes me in the face. So for instance, you're reading the Septuagint, say the very first chapter of the Greek Old Testament, Genesis 1. And it says, God divided the light from the darkness. Well, normal Greek idiom would work like English. God diakorison, he divided the accusative light from the genitive darkness. And there might be a word from, apo. Okay? But the Septuagint, written by Greek-speaking Jews, has this weird construction. God divided between the light and between the darkness, anameson and anameson. It repeats the preposition in a way that is not good Greek, it's not good English, but it is good Hebrew. Right? It's translated by a Hebrew speaker who's slavishly preserving the grammatical construction of the Hebrew. And this happens very frequently in the New Testament, so much so that many evident Hebraisms or Aramaisms are missed by scholars who haven't read enough non-Judaic classical Greek to see that it's different and weird. So you ever think about the word for Passover in the New Testament? Well, it's an Aramaic word, topaska, right? Or the word for the Sabbath. In some of the Gospels, it's neuter plural, ta sabata, as though it were a plural neuter noun. Why? Well, because the Aramaic ended in the determinative ending. The means we're talking about the Sabbath, not just any old Sabbath. And then it gets brought into Greek this way. Early in the late 19th, early 20th century, Gustav Daumann of the Institutum Judaicum was a great source for Aramaic studies. One of the challenges, he wrote some books about the words of Jesus. What Aramaic can we see behind the utterances that Jesus tells in the Gospels? This can be challenging for me as a fairly conservative Christian. I'm ordained in the Reformed Episcopal Church. I know you're probably in the PCA or other conservative Presbyterianism. It can be a challenge to hear this sort of thing. Wait a minute. You're saying that we need to go look at the Aramaic or the Hebrew behind the Greek, but we don't have those, right? Are you saying that the Greek is not sufficient? Well, we're not saying that the Greek is not inspired. We're not saying that the Greek is not authoritative. We're saying that there's some background that we need in order to understand it. So when Jesus is arrested, he's brought by Pilate into the praetorium. Okay. What is this word? Well, it's a Latin word that's been borrowed into Greek, right? And if you want to know what it means, good luck figuring that out from the pages of the Bible. You're going to need to go consult a Latin dictionary or a Greek dictionary that tells you this is a loan word and here's where it comes from. And here's the context culturally for you to know what it means. And so that, I think, is what we're doing with Aramaic and Hebrew roots behind, or constructions behind the Greek. One of the best insights, I thought, is gleanable from Aramaic background is precisely concerning the crucial words, "this is my body." Right? And you may remember at the Marburg Disputation, where Luther and Zwingli got together to have their cage match, Luther was so insistent, as one of my own bishops is, that "is" means "is," right? And Jesus didn't say, it's a symbol of my body.
Before Bill Clinton made this insistence, Martin Luther did.
It depends on what the meaning of is, right?
You're right.
and so this is the sentence that Luther writes in beer foam on the table in Marburg. And poor Zwingli, not the best Hebrewist, doesn't know any Aramaic. He doesn't have an answer to it. But Oecolampadius, who's a bystander and watching this debate at the time, Huschein is his German name, he knew Aramaic. And I'm sure he was just, "Oh, Luther, what are you doing?" There is no word "is" in that sentence if you translate it into Aramaic, right? So laying emphasis on this word is a big mistake, right? Let alone saying "is" means "is." How often is that really true, right? Do we usually use the word "is" to mean is metaphysically identified with in an ontological way? Is that how we use it?
Right.
Hardly. But this word "body," if we look at the Aramaic behind it, it's probably the word "guf," right? Guf. And when you put possessive or personal suffixes on the end of this word, say the suffix "e," meaning mine. Okay, so now it's not just goofy, it's goofy, right? Goofy. But goofy, yes, the literal, au pied de la lettre meaning of goofy would be my body. Right? But in Aramaic idiom, it means myself. Right? And so if we don't insist upon this. Right? This is somewhat speculative, as all such retroversions into Aramaic must be speculative. We don't have it, so we can't prove that that's what he said. But it seems likely. Right? It makes good sense in the context for Jesus to be saying, this piece of Messiah bread that you all know, that you've been eating all your lives to anticipate the Messiah as part of the grand sweep of the Passover narrative that you live vicariously in your feasting. Right? Modern Jews, they dip their finger in the wine and drip 10 drops of plagues on their plate to reenact the Exodus from Egypt. Right? And they spread the bitter. It's a haroset. It's an apple and horseradish sauce, and they spread it on their matzah, like water on the bricks. We suffered bitterly doing construction projects for Pharaoh. Well, we don't have any evidence that kind of playing with your food was operative in the case of Jesus and his disciples. But we do have testimony that Hillel, in the 1st century BC, right, so before Jesus' time, instructed his disciples, we're going to eat the bitter herbs in a sort of little sandwich with the unleavened bread. Right? so that freedom and slavery are experienced together in the consciousness of Jews who are taking part in the Passover. Right? So that's before Jesus. Anyway, so we're suggesting that when Jesus takes up this piece of bread, this piece of matzah that all his disciples already know, and says, "This is my body," they don't say, "Oh, your body as opposed to your spirit," a very Cartesian or Greek way of thinking about it. Very likely they said, "Oh, you mean you're the Messiah," right? Which would be consistent with the way he identifies himself as the Messiah elsewhere. So Aramaic can be helpful. There's some wonderful tools. It's becoming more and more available to us. There's a marvelous tool online, the Comprehensive Aramaic Lexicon, with links to the Targums and other Aramaic texts, Dead Sea Scrolls, and so forth. And we're kind of at this point in New Testament studies where people realize that if you want to make a case about what Aramaic-speaking or Hebrew-speaking first-century Jews meant when they said the things that are reported to us in Greek in the Gospels, you're going to need to appeal to these languages.
Right. That's very helpful, and it can be disorienting because, of course, this is looking at the Lord's Supper in that sort of participatory narratival sense is different than the way we often think about what we're getting out of it. The word we often focus on, there's the debate about "this is my body," but in at least in American evangelicalism, a word that's focused on a lot is this word "remember." What do you think the word "remember" is doing here? Do this in remembrance of me. And this is, of course, Paul repeats this in 1 Corinthians. What do you think is going on with the word "remember" and its significance in the supper?
Yeah, I would like to suggest that this word needs to be understood not in the cognitive terms that are the first thing we think of in Cartesian modernism that we're all swimming around in, but in the way the first century Jew like Paul would have understood it. So our family, just last week, we visited a Christian Reformed church, right? So in the Dutch tradition. And as was the case when we were missionaries in the Philippines, we also attended this delightful Filipino Reformed church using a liturgy very similar to the CRC. And when they do the Lord's Supper, the instructions to the congregation are eat, drink, remember, and believe, and with that remember command, an emphasis on cognition and memory. But as I've said earlier, I don't think the Jews thought about the Passover as working by our thinking about it. And I don't think the Lord's Supper is an edible flashcard, right? That it works mainly by our thinking, and that a bunch of people eating things together is sort of ancillary sideshow to the main act of what's going on in between your ears. Recall, again, the original Passover saved Israel from a destroying angel while they were asleep. So within the Reformed tradition, there have been attempts, especially by my beloved Reformed Paedo-Communionist friends, to urge that this word remembrance should be understood in terms of God's remembering. It is, after all, not a command, remember. It says, do this. That's the command, the imperative. Right? Do this, eis tenemen anamnesin. Right? Do this as my memorial. Okay. Well, whose remembering makes a difference here? We think of Cornelius. The angel tells him, your alms and your prayers have come up for a memorial before God. Right? Or that the rainbow in the sky after Noah's flood is for a memorial. It's not really about you remembering. That your remembering is neither here nor there as far as saving power and efficacy. It's God's remembering that makes a difference. And so some theologians have urged that that's what's going on here. The Eucharist is a representation of Christ's sacrifice to God. And there's some aspects of that are correct. There are others that maybe that we would find troubling, especially when the Eucharist is misunderstood as a re-sacrificing of Christ, as it is in some Roman Catholic writers. But I think the core instinct that it's God's remembering that matters, that's correct. And I'd also point to another verb in 1 Corinthians 11 that has been similarly misunderstood. as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim, katangelete, the Lord's death until he comes. Well, this verb angelo is used in the Septuagint to render Exodus 13's verb, you shall tell your son in that day, you shall tell, right? Higata, right? It's the verb higad, the verb that Haggadah comes from, Passover Haggadah, right? The narrative, the order of prayers and songs and other rituals that are done, the script, as it were, the order of service for the Seder that is celebrated to this day. In other words, you proclaim the Lord's death. It's a verb that speaks of the narrative meaning of the Passover celebration. And that's how Paul intends the Eucharist to be celebrated. The ritual meal is a re-narration of the events of Christ's death. Notice he doesn't say the ritual meal is accompanied by an oral recitation of the events. The meal itself, like the Passover before it, is a ritual showing forth of the death. So this is another instance, I think, where thinking about the Hebrew or Aramaic connotations behind the Greek New Testament's diction can help us clarify our thinking about how the Eucharist works.
Right. And perhaps this has been implicit in what we've discussed so far, but maybe we could make it even more explicit. What kinds of pastoral implications do you think this understanding of the supper has for our, we do this every week, or a lot of people do it every week. How does this help us spiritually benefit from the Eucharist, perhaps? Let me put it that way.
You may think this is a bit of a cop-out, but the number one benefit that I think we get from this, and for me it is the main one, is that we now have a more vivid and meaningful understanding of what Jesus was saying and doing to his disciples in the upper room. Right? That's the number one benefit. Jesus now is in 3 dimensions and stands off the page for us a little bit more. Right? Secondly, the corporate and narrative dimensions of the Passover, on this view, are much more important than any private or introspective spirituality. We are encouraged by this view to think about ourselves as members of a people, ritually celebrating a meal that unites the people of God to the Messiah and identifies Jesus as the Messiah that we're united to. And so that really, this is a big claim, but I think it really renders largely irrelevant many of the debates that have caused so much hostility and tension in Christian history, especially debates like that between Luther and Zwingli, or the ones that continue today, even in my own conservative Anglicanism, over so-called real presence and the mechanics of how do the elements get transmogrified or transubstantiated. It encourages us to, not to traffic in a Greek versus Hebrew dichotomy here, but to put aside those medieval categories for trying to understand what happens and to think about it as a first century Jew might have. How am I united to Christ's death and resurrection? Right? This is something that I'm to understand happened to me. Right? If Gamaliel says every Jew who partakes of the Passover is bound to regard himself as though he personally passed out of Egypt, Paul says the bread which we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? And notice he doesn't say the bread which we break, is it not the body of Christ? And we got to scratch our heads and wonder how the bread becomes body. What he says is that it is a participation. It's a way of us being involved and sharing in Jesus and the things that happened to him. And so I think it's a great gain in coherence. It hangs together perfectly well with the rest of Pauline and Jesus' sacrament, soteriology, right? It is Pauline soteriology applied to a ritual meal. Salvation is by union with Christ. It's by being joined to Christ in his death and resurrection. That is the core of what salvation is in the New Testament. It would be very surprising if Paul thought that we get some other benefits from the Lord's Supper. And it would be very consistent if that is in fact what the Lord's Supper is about. And so delving into all the Jewish sources and looking at all the Aramaic and Hebrew options behind the Greek and coming up with this, I think it's tremendously reassuring that we've understood it right. It has the ring of truth to it. And then this is not a pastoral implication. I know you're asking about pastoral implications, but just sort of another scholarly and historical consideration. We have very vivid and realistic language from the Church Fathers. So I think it's Tertullian talking about Gnostics. They don't do the supper. They don't observe the Eucharist because they don't believe it is the body and blood of Christ. Right? Well, we need to be able to account for that sort of vividly realistic language. Right? There's the way that I think a lot of the tradition has tended to account for it is to say, aha, this is really a transubstantiation or transmogrification happening, and the whole early church knew it, and the Gnostics didn't get it, or they rejected that doctrine, and that's why we get people like Irenaeus or Tertullian faulting them for it and using this very realistic language. And I want to say, well, that very realistic terminology on the part of the Church Fathers is something we need to be able to explain. We need to be able to show how we got from the way the New Testament talks to the way those Church Fathers talk. And I would submit to you that a view that sees the Eucharist operating in the mind of Paul and other disciples, operating in this sort of narratival and you are involved in the events type of way, that gives us the sort of vividness that can underwrite that realistic language from the Church Fathers in a way that certain other views, some of them very excellent. I have a lot of sympathy, for instance, with John Calvin's view that in the Eucharist we ascend into the heavenlies rather than a transformation of the elements taking place. The problem is there's not a lot of language in the New Testament about us ascending in the Eucharist. Right? That's not how Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 11. The difficulty with that sort of language, or worse, with the sort of cognitive, it works by you thinking about it, is that it's very, very difficult to explain the genesis and the origin of this realistic language from the Church Fathers on that sort of view. If that's what Paul and Jesus taught, then how did they go off the rails? Right.
Right. Who, for those who might want to would be interested in following up with somebody doing a good history of the Eucharist in the Apostolic Fathers and in those first several centuries, is there a scholar you recommend or a work you recommend that surveys that fairly well and compellingly?
Well, Dorwell Stone is helpful. He's an older Anglican writer. I really like Nathaniel Dimmock among earlier sort of evangelical and low church Anglican scholars. He really goes through the text of the Church Fathers and says, okay, Roman Catholic theologians and Bellarmine and so forth have been trying to father their Corpus Christi processions and their transubstantiation doctrine that they got from Paschasius Redbertus and high medieval period. They're trying to find that in the Church Fathers, and he just goes through with a fine-tooth comb all the Greek passages, and it's copiously footnoted and translated, and it's really excellent. So that's what I would commend to people. Look at Dimmock's treatment of that. Eucharistic Worship in the English Church is one of his books. I'm trying to remember the other titles, but they're escaping me right now.
All right. Well, this has been very helpful. Just as a kind of final question here, then, in your judgment, what ought to be more central in these kinds of debates? This is one topic, but maybe you think this has implications for larger things that we study. Another way of asking this, what do sacramental theologians or even New Testament scholars focus on that you consider distraction, and what ought we to be focused on? What kind of, lessons can we learn from this kind of scholarship?
Mm-hmm. Well, first let me say, I'm really tremendously excited. I think it's an interesting time in New Testament studies and in studies of historical sacramentology. It's unfortunate that some are still trying to sort of father their own traditional views on the Eucharist onto the text. And sometimes they do this in ways of very bad philology. For instance, I talk in the book about one particular Roman Catholic scholar who really wants to find real presence in the Bible, wants to get some warrant for it. And he appeals to the showbread in the Old Testament, the bread that is placed out on a table before the Lord, because the Hebrew term for it is lechem panim, right? And he says, well, panim, literally face, but panim can mean presence. So lechem panim means the bread of the presence. Well, no. It's the bread that is put lifnei, before the face of God. It doesn't mean God's present in the bread. It means the bread is in the presence of God. So, on the one hand, I would dissent from that view. On the other hand, I'm delighted that even somebody who's a partisan and trying to find their own doctrine in the text is forced to go to the Hebrew and look, right, and try to find sources of Jewish background literature that will help prove what they're claiming. Another scholar is again trying to find real presence, and he points to the Targums, the Aramaic translations of the Old Testament that were read in the synagogues, and there's a Palestinian Targumic tradition of understanding the manna as how did it come down from heaven? Where is it now? And we see some of this echoed in the New Testament, right? That the resurrected Jesus in Revelation promises to give his followers to eat. To those who overcome, he will give to eat of the hidden manna, right? So the manna is still there somewhere with God. And so the question arises, can the manna tradition, can the way Jews thought about manna in their Aramaic translations that were read in synagogues, can that underwrite a real presence view? So on the one hand, I'm not persuaded by either of those views, but I'm delighted with the methodological shift. We have turned a corner. We are no longer going to be writing Latin words in beer froth on a wooden table in Marburg. We're going to be appealing to Jewish sources and understanding Jesus as he really was as a Jew. And that's going to be the criteria. Those would be the criteria by which we evaluate the plausibility of sacramentologies that are proposed. If you want to say that Jesus meant this or that Paul meant that, the appeal has to be to the Jewish background. That's the benefit of the third quest.
Right. Well, this has been really helpful. For those who are listening, I'm talking with Dr. Matthew Colvin, who again has recently written this excellent book, The Lost Supper, Revisiting Passover and the Origins of the Eucharist. Matthew, thanks again for being with us here today. And for our listeners, you've been listening to the Pilgrim Faith Podcast. And until next time, we will see you later.
Thanks so much.